In this lecture, we will discuss the mechanism of reentrant ventricular tachycardia. In a previous lecture, we discussed ventricular tachycardia, or VTAC, in detail. Remember, ventricular tachycardia is a wide, complex tachycardia originating from within the ventricles. Okay, so if you look here, we have our origin here in the ventricles. All right, and this is a fast, so wide, complex tachycardia that we see going on here with a regular rhythm of our QRS intervals. Okay, now we mentioned in that lecture that there are three main mechanisms that have been proposed. There's the reentry mechanism, there's a triggered activity mechanism, and then there's an enhanced automaticity mechanism. The main one I want to discuss here is the reentry mechanism, which is the most common of these three. So this reentry mechanism requires two distinct conduction pathways with a conduction block in one pathway and a region of slow conduction in the other. It typically develops as a result of abnormal myocardial damage or scarring, such as from ischemia or infarction. Okay, let's take a closer look at this reentry mechanism. So notice here that we have the end of the Purkinje system with two different pathways innervating the ventricular muscle. Okay, so if you look here, we'll orient ourselves. Here's our Purkinje system. Okay, we come down our conduction system to our Purkinje system. Here's the ventricular cavity. Okay, so where the blood would be. Here's our ventricular muscle, and here's our ventricular apex. Okay, so we have our Purkinje fibers that are innervating our apex. Okay. Now, normally the impulse will travel down the Purkinje system into the ventricle. If there's more than one pathway to the ventricle, the impulses will simply travel down both pathways, depolarize the ventricles, and then cancel each other out if they merge. Okay, so imagine here we have our impulse that's coming down. Okay, there's two fibers or two pathways, so we'll go down both pathways. They come down, depolarize our ventricles. They then spread both ways, okay, and those that come together will cancel each other out right in the middle. Okay, so that's normal physiology. That's normal physiology in a normal heart, and there's no structural heart disease in that case. Now imagine if there's some sort of insult, such as in the setting of coronary artery occlusion. Okay, this may result in subendocardial ischemia and consequent damage to one of these tracts. So if you look here, or looking at a case of ischemia or infarction, we have this coronary artery present here. Notice we have this occlusion, okay, and as a result of it, we get this subendocardial ischemia represented here in that red region, so in this area, okay. So because of that, remember we have two pathways. We had this first and the second. Now this one on this first pathway on our left will be damaged because of that subendocardial ischemia, where the second pathway on the right is still able to conduct an impulse through. Okay. Now in such cases, the impulse will travel down the normal pathway without being blocked. However, the side with the damaged tract will block the weak impulse attempting to travel down it. Okay. So as you look down here, imagine you have this case here, okay? You have the impulse coming down. It goes down this pathway that's not obstructed or not affected and depolarizes our ventricles, okay? Now, if it comes to this area where there's that damage present, it will be blocked, okay? So that weak impulse of the Purkinje system is blocked by this depressed region that is damaged, okay? So one of the impulses made it through and will spread and depolarize the ventricles. As it spreads towards the region that was blocked, the stronger ventricular impulse will either be able to propel the impulse retrogradely through the depressed region, or it will remain blocked. If it can get through, this means a unidirectional block is present, and if it can't get through, that means a bidirectional block is present. Okay, so now this is between bidirectional, which is this case here, and unidirectional. Okay, so in bidirectional, okay, here's our block. Again, what we have going on is the impulse comes down. Let's use a different color. Down this normal pathway, is able to depolarize the ventricles, spreads throughout this region, and tries to go back up but is blocked. Okay, so that area is blocked, and we call that a bidirectional block because it's blocked going one way, initially down it, and it's also blocked going backwards up it retrogradely. Okay, so that's a bidirectional block. On the other hand, we have this unidirectional block, meaning one pathway is blocked. So it's able to come down our pathway, starts spreading both ways, and tries to go retrogradely through the block and is able to get through. So this is able to get through the block in this area. Okay, so it's only blocked going in this direction. So blocked that way, but is able to go through. That strong ventricular impulse is able to bypass that depressed region there. Okay, so that's bidirectional and unidirectional blocks. Now with a bidirectional block, there's essentially one pathway system, and therefore no reentry circuit can be created. However, with a unidirectional block, we have the potential for a reentry circuit to develop. In other words, because the stronger ventricular impulse was able to make it through retrogradely, if the time needed to complete the circuit is less than the refractory period, then a reentrant arrhythmia can result. And in this case, that would be a reentrant ventricular tachycardia. Okay, so what we have going on here is that in this case, so remember, with the bidirectional, we cannot have this reentrant form because it's blocked in both directions. However, it's our unidirectional block that can give us this reentrant ventricular tachycardia. And what we're saying here is the impulse is coming down initially, able to spread, and then get through this track, okay? And what you see here is this is going to start cycling around if the time to complete that circuit is less than the refractory period, okay? And that's what we call this reentrant ventricular tachycardia, okay? So again, it was only during this unidirectional block that allowed retrograde conduction and the potential for the reentry circuit to form. This was not the case with the bidirectional block. All right, so that's reentry mechanism and the most common of the three mechanisms of ventricular tachycardia. I really hope that makes sense. So let's briefly review what we discussed before we end here. So again, reentry VTAC is the most common mechanism, okay? It occurs with the unidirectional block, okay? And we said after an insult. In this case, we saw ischemia or infarction or some sort of occlusion, okay? Now, the general course of this reentrant form is that it travels down one path, okay? The other pathway is blocked, as we saw. However, the ventricular impulse is able to bypass that depressed region on the way back up, so traveling retrogradely. And because of that, if the time to complete that circuit is less than the refractory period, we can have this reentrant circuit that forms. Well, that's the end of this lecture. We discussed the mechanism of reentrant ventricular tachycardia. I hope you learned something.